Good morning, everybody. My name is Charlotte DeCoster. I'm the Director of Education at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And today we are continuing our series every Tuesday at 11 a.m. called A Glimpse into the Museum. Today we will be looking at a part of our Human Rights Wing and the International Military Tribunal and how it is set up within the exhibition, and giving a little bit more of a deep dive into that area of the museum. This is a virtual webinar, so if you would like to ask any questions, there is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen or built into Zoom, and there you can post your questions. I can take questions throughout. I do want to ask, if you are posting a question in our Q&A, to please make it as direct as possible and as short as possible, so that I don't have to spend too much time rereading the full question before I answer it to the public broadcast to everyone. So again, you can use that Q&A button on the screen as well. If you have logistical questions, my co-host today is our programs coordinator, Mr. Spencer Cronin, and he will be helping you as well with logistical questions. So I will not be reading out those questions. He will respond them to you if there are any technical difficulties that we can solve throughout the webinar. Today the lecture will be a glimpse into the museum, representational justice after the Holocaust, looking at the International Military Tribunal. If you are interested in continuing to follow our lecture series on the glimpse into the museum, next week at 11 a.m. our archivist is going to take you more in for her glimpse into the museum on an experience looking at the artifact in our permanent exhibition, more specifically the Holocaust artifacts from our Holocaust wing. I just wanted to give that as a heads up for next week as well. So the International Military Tribunal and the discussion of this concept of representational justice is part of our Human Rights Wing. We have three wings that are at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. The first wing is our Holocaust Shoah wing, which geographically narrates the history of the Holocaust and the Shoah. That is followed by our Human Rights wing. And finally, our third wing is our Pivot to America, which we more look at human and civil rights in the United States. For the Human Rights Wing, we have three large galleries. The first one, which you can see here on my screen, is our International Military Tribunal Gallery. It is followed by the Human Rights Gallery, looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then finally, our 10 Stages of Genocide Gallery, in which we had the glimpse a few weeks ago, looking at the 10 stages of genocide. The whole idea of this Human Rights Wing is to look at these big concepts of human rights and genocide, and especially how they evolve after the Holocaust. And so the starting point really for that discussion is the International Military Tribunal and what happens at Nuremberg. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, is that formation of these concepts, and especially within that within those concepts, the concept of representational justice, how that is formed and how it really represents a more modern way of bringing international justice, and what that has led to today and the legacy that grows out of that. So you can see here a little glimpse into the exhibit. I hope that after our temporary closure, y'all can come and really browse and deep dive again in this area. It's a really spectacular area in the exhibits, and gives you a much better understanding of the impact of the Holocaust, but also of the Nuremberg Trials. So let's start our discussion here with it really begins. The question that comes in really starting 1943 and 1944 when the Allied powers start understanding what is happening in German-occupied Europe, the atrocities that are committed by the German army, by the Nazis, the SS, and the Einsatzgruppe, what is happening in the ghettos. And as more images get released, first by the Soviets of the atrocities that are committed in the East as they are liberating, starting in 43, 44, and 45, and then also by the Western Allies, noticing the liberation of the camps, starting in 45 as well as adding on it. And as all of this information is coming in, the reaction to it and the realization that this is a big turn in history. And how do we deal with that in the sense of what will happen to the war criminals, those who committed those atrocities? What will we do? What now, right? If this war ends, if we get to that point where the Germans are defeated and Axis power is defeated, well, what will we do? How will we move forward? What kind of justice will we seek? Will there be justice sought? Will there be revenge? What precedence is there set? What needs to happen to create some kind of system of making really the people who committed those crimes, committed those atrocities, how can we have them claim some kind of responsibility? And that is a very difficult question. And that question doesn't start in 1945. That question starts already during the war. The Western Allied leaders are talking about this, and the Allies in general, with the Soviet Union included, are really starting 42, 43, is starting to open that dialogue on what should happen, what will we do? So I wanted to start with that because the International Military Tribunal will embrace that question of what now, what after, what will we do? And out of that, as I said, some of the bigger concepts will develop and get the more modern understanding of what we have today of human rights and genocide. So this initial question of what now, what after in respect to law and justice is very pivotal in human history. And because of that, the International Military Tribunal will set a new tone in international justice that has not been seen before. So let's start with the beginning of where that discussion starts. And in October 1943, when the Allies meet to meet in the Soviet Union and diplomats from the different Allied powers sit together and start having that discussion on planning what should happen when this war is over. What are the negotiations needed? And one of the first things that comes out of that in October of 1943 is the Moscow Declaration on Atrocities, is making it clear to the Germans and their allies, Austria, Italy, that the Allies are aware of the atrocities that they're committed and that there will be punishment for those atrocities committed. There is not a statement of exactly what those punishments will be, but there is a statement that each one of the countries where these atrocities are committed will have some kind of platform where justice will be brought. And so I just want to read you a short part of kind of introduction of what the Moscow Declaration is. So this is directly from it. The United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union hereby solemnly declare those German officers and men and members of the Nazi Party responsible for atrocities, massacres, and executions will be sent back to the countries in which they abominable deeds were done, in order that they may be judged and punished according to the laws of these liberated countries. So you can hear very direct and strict words of saying these deeds, these atrocities that you committed will be judged and they will be punished. And this is the first statement, this kind of first reference to those who are committing those atrocities, that that the world, in a sense, is watching, and that there will be some repercussions if you are participating in those punishments, in those atrocities. So this is the first really kind of reference that the Allies are thinking about it, that they are starting that planning for post-war, right, is what to do with these war criminals. This is really directed at those who are responsible for committing those, as it said, as I just read out, those committing the atrocities, the massacres, and the executions. So it's directly layered at the lower level, those who are participating in that. We don't really see that discussion yet of the broader society being part of this, which will enter the discussion as well. So, as the conversation is really truly now on an international level among the Allies opened with the Moscow Declaration on Atrocities, the further dialogue happens of what should we really do? What should the punishment be? What should the response be? And that becomes a much more complicated situation, right? It's much more easier to make the statement, okay, you will be judged and you will be punished, but how will this happen? And of course, you can just, you know the different allies involved, right? We have Britain, who at that point is led by Churchill. We have the Soviet Union, led by Stalin, and you have the United States, who at that point is led by President Roosevelt. So strong personalities, strong opinions, and strong countries as well, who all want to have their voice in there. Now, the precedent set for this is not as easy as you think. We, see Nuremberg as this obvious, as creating these trials and putting war criminals on trials. But there is not a huge precedent set for an international trial. There's one instance after World War I. There was a trial set, and it's not fully fledged trial. It's not what Nuremberg will eventually become, but it becomes some kind of judgment trial for Germany, but it is held by the Germans in Germany, and it's very different. So it doesn't really although it is in a sense an international trial, it has made that baby step there already. There is no really full-fledged international style. Really what the main precedence is for war crimes and crimes committed during war is summary execution. You just, in a sense, quietly, no trial, no nothing, but you execute those who committed those atrocities, the mass murders, you just execute them. A lot of times they are taken to the location where they committed those crimes, and then they're executed. No trial, no nothing. The other one is to do a very public show trial. Show trial meaning is that you have already found this person guilty, but you're just, for the public, creating a trial so that you can lay their accusation against them and say what they have done wrong, and you then find them guilty, and then they are executed. This is, in a sense, is a much more public execution, right? It is a trial followed by a public execution. So summary execution, in a sense, is kind of away from the public, is punishing them by hanging or by execution in different ways, very quiet, kind of not making it public. And the second one is very public through the show trials. The show trial was kind of a precedence that was heavily set. I added some images here. In the Soviet Union, both before and after the war, I put two images up there. One is the one on the bottom right, is one before the war, is these 20s and 30s show trials under the Stalinist regime. And on the top is an actual post-war, it's Witold Pilecki as his show trial He was a Polish resistance fighter, so he's not even a Nazi. Actually, he fought the Nazis. It's a public show trial there as well. And then the Nazis, they held the German People's Court was basically those people were found guilty already before they came to, and then they were executed. Those were public show trials as well. So those were really the precedents set. And you can probably figure out who preferred what. Stalin, as you can imagine, heavily promoted the concept of a show trial. Whereas Churchill really wanted to get this over and done quick with. He didn't want this to make a spectacle. He didn't want there to enter an element of revenge that a show trial and anger that could rise out of a show trial. So he just felt much more comfortable with summary execution. So you have these two strong leaders, one really promoting a show trial and one summary execution. And then you have a third world leader in there, Roosevelt, who falls kind of in between and will swing the pendulum on what he really wants, especially once he starts witnessing what has happened in the camps, and more evidence is coming from the liberating army, the U.S. liberating armies. This just starts worrying him, and this becomes a major part of it. But within his administration, there's people who are not as comfortable with that, who are not ready for either a show trial or summary execution, and they are more pushing for some kind of civil or military court, which is quite differently. So this back and forward starts happening, and this leads us to February of 1945. In which our three world leaders, you can see here first Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin, coming together and start planning for this post-war world. Yes, I always throw a little quick reminder out there is that the planning for this post-war world starts way before this war is over, and this world leaders understand also that they are could fall in opposition to each other, and of course by the time we are in 45 we slowly have to start with the Cold War with that as well. So these meetings are very important. These are big decisions of what will happen, and this concept of justice and these war criminals is very important in that, especially to Stalin and Churchill, because they, from their perspective, they fought a World War I. They came out of that, and their countries then went into World War II, and the Germans came relatively strong and with a sense of revenge out of World War I, and that played into this discussion here. Again, that split, what I've talked about summary executions and the show trials. So it is Roosevelt who really starts first pushing for more of a concept of here slowly at Yalta of creating some kind of trial, an international trial led by the Allies that would put these major war criminals on trial. What that structure is not really set yet at Yalta, but it is pushed for. And we start seeing out of Yalta, when these leaders come together, that first formation of that. Now, two of those won't be around anymore much longer when it comes to these negotiations. Roosevelt will die and Truman will take over. And it is really Truman who continues really for that pushing of an official trial. And why this was so important, eventually became so important to Roosevelt and Truman, is that that this wasn't just about these war criminals, but it was also about what this trial would represent. That this wasn't just about a few people who did something wrong, but that this was about a society, about a nation, about a collective responsibility of what had happened, that these atrocities did not just lay on the SS and on Hitler and these few henchmen, that really the Germany as a society should be put on trial. And with that, we really get the development that this trial, this international trial that will be formed, is not just anymore about these war criminals, these few, the leaders, but it becomes about German society. So those who will be put on trial will represent the segments of society. And this is where we get the development and the structure of representational justice, is putting a few on trial for representing the many, representing society. And that's how the Nuremberg framework is set up, how this new precedence of a new international trial, a trial based on representational justice, is formed and will be built. And that concept has since then really taken root. And we'll talk, first I'm going to lay out a little bit of the structure, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the legacy that the International Military Tribunal leaves as well. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I can answer them as I'm going. So if you have any questions right now about the setup for this, you can put them in the Q&A. Again, quick reminder just to keep your questions as short as possible. Okay, I'll make sure that I got my. So I want to start this this discussion of the International Military Tribunal with the opening statement by the Chief Justice Robert H. Jackson, the Chief Counsel and Prosecutor for the United States, and his opening statement saying that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. And here is Jackson is really laying that framework of what that this trial is not about, in a sense, vengeance. It is not about this is not a show trial. This is something really new. This is a civil law trial in a military court that will show and document and demonstrate through evidence, as a trial usually does, that crimes were committed, and that the accused will be punished based on those crimes committed, on the evidence shown. And so this became the strict format of Nuremberg, of the International Military Tribunals. There would be charges brought, and we'll discuss those in a second. There will be defendants. There will be 4 lead judges and 4 substitute judges, each from one of the countries, from one of the 4 countries represented. That is the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Britain. So you have 1 judge from each country, and then a backup judge for each. And then prosecution teams from each of these allied countries. So British prosecutor and his team, a French prosecutor, Soviet prosecutor, and an American prosecutor. And then, of course, a defense team for the defendants. And that is the structure. The main base of this trial will be using evidence. This evidence really will exist about a lot of documentation. Just to kind of give you an understanding how this trial will be based on documentation and not as much eyewitness stories, is that 240 witnesses are brought, but in contrast, 2,630 documents are entered into evidence, mountains and mountains of evidence. So actually, if you come and visit our museum, we have kind of this display set up where you can see the piles of documents based, and you can see some of those images of the prosecution teams going through endless and endless documentation through that. So, evidence, document evidence became a big way of showing that this was a fair trial. Now, that doesn't leave the International Military Tribunal without any bias, of course. There was some talking about, why all allied judges, why not neutral judges? And that was really to make sure that the allied powers could remain unbiased, that the role of a judge is to remain unbiased, and that they could do that in this case, but also to make sure that especially the Soviet Union, where many of these atrocities were committed, is that they would have some platform of making that judgment as well. And the lead judge, in this case, the British judge, will really make sure that continuously through in that trial, that bias stays out of it, and that everything will be based on this evidence. They understood the importance, the world stage that they were on, that this was very important, and that for the future this would remain important as well, that this was setting a precedence for something. Okay, I have some questions coming in. James asked, where do you see restitution of looted goods, art, and cultural antiquities playing into representational justice? The representational justice in this case for the International Military Tribunal is not on the cultural elements. It is really focused on the extreme atrocities committed by by German society against humans. So we'll talk about that with the charges. You'll see a lot of them are aimed at instigating war, wars of aggression, and instigated against crimes against humanity. So follow-up trials will follow after this, and that will be talked about a little bit in the legacy of Nuremberg. Sarah asked, who defended them? Yes, there was a whole German defense team, several attorneys. Each one of the defendants also had their personal defense lawyer as well. And then together there was a lead defense attorney that led the whole German defense team. So you can find all of those names. There's a long list of names that you can find, and just Google International Military Tribunal Defense Team, and you'll get the whole list of all of the different defense attorneys being part of that. So part of the representational justice is bringing charges that really would reflect on what specifically these defendants would be accused of. So at Nuremberg, 4 big charges were brought. Some of them that already existed, like kind of wars of aggression and war crimes had existed in international law, and then more new developed concepts of international law would be brought through these charges. So the first one is the charge of what we really can see is conspiracy. This is the planning part. It is an agreement between 2 or more people to commit a crime at some point in the future. So a lot of times the more modern charge, which does not exist yet at the International Military Tribunal, is genocide. Genocide will appear in the notes. It will be addressed. And usually it falls under that charge here at Nuremberg, or is addressed under the concept of conspiracy, and that waging of wars of aggression and crimes against peace. So this is where genocide gets discussed, and the term is going to come up. But the charge really here is the planning, and it is basically being the orchestrator of everything, coming up with the concept And so this is a big charge that will be brought, and a lot of times this will involve showing who the leaders are, who was behind it. Then the second charge is the initiating and waging wars of aggression and crimes of peace. That is actually being part of is initiating and waging these military conflicts without justifications of self-defense. So this is basically enslavement of other people, is territorial gain, is basically you're attacking somebody and subjugating them before they attack you, or so there's no claim of self-defense whatsoever. Then the third charge is the charge of war crimes, are acts that constitutes a serious violation of the laws of war that give rise to individual criminal responsibility. And then finally, a new one that enters as well is crimes against humanity. These are widespread or systematic attacks directed against any civilians or identifiable part of civilian population. This is where the Holocaust, the Shoah, will play part in that, in crimes against humanity. So they will both fall under war crimes, but against crimes against humanity as well. So the word Holocaust, Shoah, won't legally enter. There is no charge of that. But the concept, the claim against the Holocaust at the International Military Tribunal will come through those crimes against humanity. Now, do you understand? The International Military Tribunal is one trial. There are many Nuremberg trials. So the Nuremberg trials are a nickname for the collection of trials that are held at Nuremberg. Today we are discussing the International Military Tribunal, which is that representational justice I'm talking about, is putting a few on trial for the crimes of of a nation, of a society. And so this is really picking some of the leaders from those different parts of society and bringing them these charges. Now, following, since I just brought up crimes against humanity, there was follow-up trials after the International Military Tribunal that looked more specifically at some of these atrocities. So there is a doctor's trial and an Einsatzgruppe trial for the mass murderers that will follow them. And what most people think of as the Nuremberg trial is really the International Military Tribunal that I'm talking about right now. And then the collection of trials together is usually nicknamed the Nuremberg trials with the S at the end. Of course, the Holocaust, the narrative of the Shoah will start during the International Military Tribunal, but will continue, especially when we get to the Einsatzgruppe trial and the doctor's trial and about the medical experiments. So this one trial, and this is why I wanted to reference one trial, right? This International Military Tribunal brought 4 charges against 24 defendants. And this is one of my, I actually took this, this is kind of a layout of what we have in the exhibit. It is the best way to, and I think our design team did such a spectacular job here, is to convey that concept of representational justice. Is those 24 defendants, and you can see them laid out there. This is actually on this enormous wall in our museum, is just 24 defendants being laid out here, each with those 4 charges and what those charges, the charges brought against them, who was indicted and who was not indicted on these 4 charges, and what their sentence was, what they actually found guilty on or not guilty on, and then their sentence as well is on each one of those 24 defendants. These 24 defendants represent really different segments from society. Some will be the Navy, such as Karl Donitz. He represents the military, but the Navy. Some of them will be representing the Air Force, the German Army. For example, General Keitel is in there, really representing the German Army and the crimes that they commit. It will have the head of the Hitler Youth in there to represent more that element, the youth of society, youth in German society, and the role that the Hitler Youth played. There, of course, will be defendants that will represent propaganda. Who is not here at this trial are some of the big guys, because they are no longer alive. Most of them have committed suicide. Hitler won't be here, he has committed suicide. Goebbels really should be the representative of propaganda, and the damage that it does will not be here because he's committed suicide. And Himmler representing the SS and what it represents. So instead, other leaders that represents these different parts of the committing of these atrocities will be there. There will be representatives of Krupp here to show the economy. There will be foreign ministers to kind of show more the State Department's role in all of these atrocities. So these 24 defendants, and I'm not even going to go through each one of them because otherwise we're going to be here for another hour, really represents these different segments of society and their role. So we have this very unique, when these charges are brought, they don't always, sometimes the charges are not all 4 charges are brought to each defendant. So they are not indicted necessarily on all 4 charges. The biggest guy here, that everybody is looking at, is Hermann Göring. He is really representing that leadership of the Nazi Party and the big guys that are not there anymore. And Göring is going to take that lead as kind of the representative of the Nazi Party, and kind of really fulfills that role at the International Military Tribunal. And for example, he is brought on all 4 charges and will be so he will be indicted on all charges and is found guilty on all charges. But that is not the case for all of them, depending on the role that they played and how it fits with those charges. So these charges are really well thought out, and these indictments are really well thought out too, is making sure that they had evidence to find each one of these people guilty on what they needed to be found guilty on the indictments, and that they could prove it using that evidence. Now, besides those 24 defendants, there's also some organizations that are put on trial. The Nazi Party Leadership Corps is also put on trial as an organization. The SS, the SA, the Gestapo, the Reichscabinet, the General Staff and High Command of the German Armed Forces. So really, the SS, the Nazi Party, the Nazi Party militias, from the Gestapo to the SS, the Reichscabinet, the ministry really of Germany, and the German army. So those organizations are put on trial as well, besides these 24 defendants. That makes up the defendants at this trial. And the reason I wanted to show you this image is because you can see those 24 defendants right there. And then look at the background. I call it the spider web, whatever you want to see in it. But you have this spider web coming out of Nuremberg, and in the background, you have the shape of Germany and the crimes that Germany commits as a society. And you can see some of the images of these crimes committed. I showed some of them earlier too. And then the 24 defendants are really tied to that spider web that kind of forms Germany, because they are representing the crimes that the society committed. So that again is that concept of representational justice, and this is such a unique way of representing it, showing it, and kind of giving you an idea of representational justice. So I just wanted to kind of show that. So I had another great quote here that I really wanted to move on. I'm sorry, I'm moving some of my papers over so I can make sure I didn't skip anything. So as the trial started, which lasted about 11 months, the prosecution brought their evidence on the indictments and made its case, and then And then, of course, defense made its case as well, each bringing their witnesses. And I already said the prosecution will mainly rely on documentation, not as much on eyewitness testimony, because the fear was that they could be said that they were making up things, that they wouldn't be understood to extreme. The other part that is really unique at the International Military Tribunal, that film is used for the first time, and a film is created called the Nazi concentration and prison camps that will be shown at the trial on this ginormous big screen in the middle, and it will show some film footage of the camps and what happened there. And you can find that film still online today. There's several websites where you can find it and witness this. So I wanted to, like I said, I can't go through each one of these defendants, but I did want to bring an example of four of these defendants to kind of give you an example of the charges and the indictments brought and how the system worked. So the first one I want to bring up is Admiral Karl Dönitz. And let's see if I can find a spider web image here. Dönitz. Oh, right here. He is right here located in the middle. I think everybody hopefully can see that. So Dönitz was really the head of the German state. He was appointed when Hitler committed suicide as the head of the German state, so representing really all of Germany. But really, he had been the head of the German Navy and was also the supreme commander now of the German armed forces. So during his role during the war, though, he really took that responsibility of being in charge of the Navy. So the charges that were brought against him were charges of conspiracy, crimes against peace, and war crimes, not crimes against humanity. He was actually not charged with that. So when it came to the verdict, it could not be proven that he was part of the planning, the conspiracy behind the long-term planning of all of this. So he was not convicted on the charge of conspiracy, but he was convicted for crimes against peace and war crimes and received 10 years in prison. This is an example of how the documentation could not prove one charge, although the prosecution tried, and showing kind of that fair semblance of a trial too, that it would be based upon the evidence. For example, Goering, all charges were brought, and he was found guilty on all charges as well. I want to give another example. The head of the party chancellery, so this is really representing almost the Nazi party here, was Martin Bormann. He was charged with conspiracy. He was not charged with crimes against peace, is that instigating of a war of aggression, war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was found guilty on war crimes and crimes against humanity, but again, not conspiracy. Why those charges still found? It was still a way to show the evidence of party involvement and showing that the planning and being able to bring that. So a lot of times charges were also brought as kind of a representation of being able to show that some of that evidence as well. Bormann, because of his heavy involvement with war crimes and crimes against humanity, was found guilty for that and was sentenced to death by hanging. So see very different sentences also based on their involvement within those charges as well that was brought then by the judges. And before I go into the legacy, I'm going to look at some of the questions here. James asked, at this time, does the general public, German citizens, still have the image of the clean Wehrmacht in their mind? Absolutely, and that image is going to last for quite a while. This was why it is so important is several of these defendants are part of the German army, the Wehrmacht, and some of them will be sentenced to death, and they will be found guilty on all charges, especially that charge of crimes against peace and war crimes will happen here. But still it will become a struggle is because as an organization, they're not really found guilty. It is more the SS and the Nazi party. And that is, weakens a little bit of that representational justice. So that is probably some of the maybe criticism that the International Military Tribunal has faced is the strength that the case brings of representational justice against the German army, the Wehrmacht. And definitely the German public kept thinking very highly of the German Wehrmacht. That is not really going to change more until the late 80s and the 1990s, when these exhibits start popping up of the atrocities that the German army commits. And I think in general, the public oftentimes thinks of the German war atrocities and atrocities committed really as a more Nazi thing, and they don't see it as a German army thing oftentimes. So that is probably one of the criticisms that comes out of Nuremberg that historians have brought against that. Sarah asked, what is the statute of limitations for war crimes? I'll have to see that, and I think that has changed over time, but so I actually don't know the answer to that, but I can look that up and probably send you that information if you're interested in that, Sarah. So the legacy of Nuremberg, what does it leave? First of all, I said the International Military Tribunal is the platform of a new concept in international law of representational justice, of putting a few on trial, really to display and to show the crimes that a society has committed. This is then followed up by the first immediate legacy of the International Military Tribunals is the follow-up trials, such as the Doctors' Trial, the Industrious Trial, the Einsatzgruppe Trial. You can see here an image of the charges brought against the Einsatzgruppe leaders in the Einsatzgruppe trial. Sorry, these are the verdicts being delivered, I'm sorry. So that is the immediate follow-up. And that continues because those trials over the years, other Nazis who committed crimes, especially crimes against humanity, have been brought back to courts, and these trials have continued. So if you come visit our exhibit, you can actually browse through some of the other Nuremberg trials and some of the more current cases that have been brought. One of the famous ones, there's some famous Netflix documentaries on the Dumjanik case and the accountant of Auschwitz and some of the other trials that have brought in. So that is the first legacy, really, that Nuremberg lays that platform of not just bringing these big guys, but later on bringing other ones and using those charges to follow up for follow-up trials and to use that kind of similar platform that is said. But more importantly, out of Nuremberg comes the development of an international law system that was not in existence before. With the creation of the United Nations, we get several courts coming out of that, and also then separately being created the International Criminal Court to bring some of these war crimes. And you can see here the building of the International Criminal Court in Den Haag, and then some of those follow-up trials as well. The tribunals, the war tribunals, international war tribunals that have been brought since the International Military Tribunal. So you can see here the tribunal for Cambodia, and then here the logo for the tribunal for Rwanda. And these tribunals, this system, in a sense, have all become collectively linked to the framework that the International Military Tribunal set up. Still a system of judges. These are not allied judges anymore now. They are considered, are neutral judges right now from neutral countries. And a system of bringing evidence, documentary and eyewitness evidence against the defendants, and but really bringing the role in together. And I want to bring in this quote from Louise Arbour, who was one of the chief prosecutors at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Romania. Is collectively we're linked to Nuremberg. We mention its name every single day. And that is really the precedence that Nuremberg says, is that system of trial, the bringing of charges. In addition to that, the charge in many of these international criminal tribunals has become the charge of genocide, which will develop with that, with the Genocide Convention, and the building up of that. Now, I do want to wrap up with some of that legacy is a unique connection to Dallas that we have in our exhibit as well. One of the prosecutors was Dallas attorney Robert Story, who after Nuremberg comes back to Dallas and becomes the dean at Southern Methodist University. Those are, is what, if you're not from the Dallas area, SMU or Southern Methodist University is one of the big universities really close to downtown Dallas. And he there became the dean of the law school and created really the, brought SMU to the international level that it is today, especially with the bringing of a department there focused on international law. And he brought many of his fellow prosecutors with him to Dallas to build that international law school. And today it has become renowned for its international law and the framework that it laid. One of those that came to SMU on the urging of Robert Story was Whitney Harris, who taught for several years at SMU. He wrote a work on the International Military Tribunal and his work at Nuremberg called Tyranny on Trial. So if you're interested in reading that, it's Whitney Harris's Tyranny on Trial. He then left, and in 1959 became the driving force in establishing the International Criminal Court and what it is today. And Harris is still lauded for his involvement both at Nuremberg and at the International Criminal Court. So the framework of our understanding of international law, especially when it comes to war crimes, comes from many of those prosecutors and the judges at Nuremberg. So that same system being used there was then brought into law departments through people like Story here in Dallas, but also people like Ben Ferencz and Whitney Harris brought their experience at Nuremberg to the International Criminal Court and to some of those war tribunals, international war tribunals that we have seen as prosecuting those who commit the act of genocide. So that is an immense legacy and a whole new change in international law that comes not only out of the history of the International Military Tribunal, but also out of the Holocaust, and why it's such an important concept for us to look at, because it will change our modern understanding of genocide and of human rights. So that was kind of my wrap up. I'll take some more questions if you want questions, and I see some more questions coming in. Ellen asks, what do you mean by neutral countries, those not involved in participating in the crime? Yes, so there are neutral countries who are not necessarily tied to the geographic area or to the crimes that are committed. So they couldn't have UN peacekeepers there or things like that at that point when the acts were being committed. Carol asked, did the United States belong to the International Criminal Court? At first, they do join, but the United States is not part of the International Criminal Court right now. But there's much more. Remember, there's different international law systems. The International Criminal Court is not the only one. For example, the tribunals are not part of the International Criminal Court. They are part of the United Nations. Kathy asked, what were the verdicts for the 4 groups found guilty? Well, they were just as representations found guilty. So the SS, the Gestapo, and the Nazis and the SA, they are found guilty. That is, again, that representational justice. And several people within those segments are, again, representing those affiliations. Brooke asked, do you recommend any sources on international law or crimes against humanity? Oh, that's a great part. Actually, it is such a complicated topic, and I still am so confused about, international law is extremely complex. We have a great organization in the Dallas area, and let me see if I can pull that up really quick. International Institute. No, that's not the one. We actually, in the Dallas area, let me see if I can bring this over in my screen. I hope y'all are able to see this. We have the Center for American Law and International Law, which is actually located in Dallas. It's just in the Plano area. And this organization was actually founded by Robert Story, one of the prosecutors, and has a huge section on international and comparative law that it gives a lot of information. So this is really for the legal community. And then I oftentimes also use just the good old Wikipedia is looking at segmenting the different levels of international law from the United Nations courts, the International Criminal Court, all of those different ones. You can also go to the United Nations website where it has a lot of information about the different structures of international law and the different courts as well, and on crimes against humanity. You can also go to the, under the United Nations, is look at the Genocide Convention and look at those crimes in the courts that use the Genocide Convention as well. So, so sources I would really recommend online is the United Nations, is K-Law, as we call it, or Center for American and International Law, and just doing basic searches on the structure system. So encyclopedias like Wikipedia can be very helpful given that basic structure and given that basic layout of how international law is structured, because it is very, very complex. I understand Nuremberg sets kind of that precedence, but from there, there's different court systems that follow out of that. And we usually have this one vision that is, international law falls under one body and that's it, but it is actually not structured that way. I hope, Brooke, that answers your question. Okay, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. As I said, you can find all of our programs on our main homepage. If you click right here under new virtual programs, it will bring you to our programs and events page. This Sunday, we have our virtual Yom HaShoah coming up, so I do hope that you join us for that, and you can register right here for that event and join us for that remembrance and commemoration. We also have our weekly series of Understanding Holocaust History coming up on April 16th. That is this Thursday at 1 p.m. And this will be a very unique opportunity where our archivist is actually going to give you a glimpse into some of our artifacts that are German propaganda books and children's books that are German propaganda that we have in our collections, and how German propaganda was used, and feeding that to children through these books. So that will be a great event as well. So I hope to see you for some of our other programs as well. And thank you so much for joining you and for your questions. All of them were great, and I hope I did a great job answering them as much as possible. Have a wonderful day and stay well.